Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile. In this discussion, we're going to talk about fragments. Fragments are pieces of an activity that we can use to modularize an activity. We can also use them as reusable components, pieces of an activity. We can think of a fragment as a mini activity. And the importance of fragments, they were introduced in Android 3.0, is that as screens get bigger, especially for tablets, there needs to be a way to organize our activity into subviews. So let's look at fragments a little bit. So first of all, what is a fragment? A fragment is a layout element. It is basically a view group. It is embedded in an activity. It can be reused in multiple activities, and it can, most importantly, contain other UI elements. So it is like an activity, but it is a subpart of an activity. Fragments, importantly, have their own life cycle. They can receive their own input events, and they can be added or removed while their host activity is running. So it's like a window that we can embed in an activity that contains other user interface elements. Now, fragments have to be associated with an activity. They are not a replacement for an activity. There is always an activity component that hosts the fragments. They are affected by that host activity's life cycle. So, for example, pausing the activity pauses all the fragments that are within that activity. So, while the activity is running, in other words, while it's in the resume state, fragments can be operated on independently. So we can maybe add a new fragment, we can delete fragments, we can remove them from view, and all of those kind of operations can be added to the backstack. They can be pushed onto the backstack by the developer, and that would enable the user to reverse these kinds of operations. So let's say your application has a menu, and in response to a user tap on one of the menu items, you pop up a fragment. Well, you can add that operation to the backstack, and then the user could just tap the back key and go back to the state the activity was in before the user brought up the new fragment. So the view group that we talked about is a class that is a root class of all the views that can contain other views. And that contains layouts like relative and linear layouts that we talked about last time, and also fragments. So fragments can be added to an existing view group in our code, or they can be defined inside the layout XML file of an activity using the fragment element. You can also define your own layout XML for your own fragments, and each fragment can have its own layout XML. This is good. This is modular. Fragments carry around their own layout. They can also be used, not very often, but you can also use a fragment as sort of a miniature service for embedded within an activity without a user interface to do some work in the background, kind of in the background, but it's still part of the activity, and it still responds to the lifecycle methods of the activity in which it's embedded. So how do we define one? High-level overview here, because in the demos we're going to see exactly how this is done in different ways. So first of all, we need to create a fragment. We extend the class fragment or one of the fragment subclasses, and we have a dialog fragment to display a dialog box. We have a list fragment to display a list of things, a preference fragment to select preferences in your application, and a web view fragment. So all of these are available choices. You can also just subclass fragment itself. Then we need to either embed a fragment tag inside the activities layout XML or define a new layout XML for the fragment. And if we do that, we need to inflate the layout in the fragment's onCreateView method. Now that's a new one. We know that the activity has an onCreate, but it also has an onCreateView. So let's look at the callback methods associated with fragments. There's two ways, or there's two kind of classifications of these callback methods, as we already know. If you think about an activity, there are callbacks associated with starting an activity up, like on create, on start, on resume, and there are callbacks associated with shutting an activity down, such as on pause, on stop, and on destroy. Well, fragments share many of these things with the activity, but they also add some other stuff. So starting up, in order, we have on attach, and we get an activity with this. When the fragment is first associated with an activity, this will be called in the fragments callbacks. Then on create and the bundle, we get the activities bundle passed in, and this is called when the fragment is created, and it's also called when the activity that contains a fragment already is created. Then we have on create view, and this we get a layout inflator, which we're going to talk about in the demos, a view group, the view group for the fragment, and a bundle. And this creates and needs to return the fragment's view. On activity created tells the fragment that its activities on create has been called, and we get the bundle with that. On view state restored tells the fragment that the state of the view has been restored from a previous state. And then, of course, we are informed when the activity containing a fragment has started, and then when the fragment has resumed. So these two are analogous to the on start and on resume of the activity in which the fragment is embedded, but they are for the fragment. Shutting down, we have on pause, on stop, and then on destroy. But we also have on destroy view, which is an opportunity for the fragment to perform cleanup activities. Then it goes through on destroy. And then finally, right before the fragment is removed from an activity, in other words, the activity is not being destroyed, but the fragment's being removed, we get a callback called on detach. So now a couple of demos to show you how to use fragments. And I just wanted to add another word here. Fragments are not especially useful when developing for a phone device, a handheld device, but they are very useful when developing for tablets. We have larger screen real estate with tablets, and so fragments come in very handy to organize a larger display. That being said, if we are developing an application that is going to be targeted for both a tablet environment and a handheld environment, then we can use fragments to organize our application, and we can embed these fragments in activities. So on the handheld, you may have one fragment per activity, but in the tablet, you can have those same fragments all embedded within one or two activities for your entire application. So fragments become a very useful tool for organizing and subdividing the view interfaces within an application. Thank you very much.